In the first part of this lecture, we discussed early analog technology. In this part, we will discuss the influence of microprocessors. In terms of the parts of the circuitry that actually generate sound, the sequential Prophet 5 is very much like the ARP2600 or the Mini Moog or other analog synths that we looked at in the previous part of this lecture series. All of the sound generating circuitry is still analog. The main difference is that instead of the various knobs on the front panel being potentiometers that are directly hooked into that analog sound generating circuitry, the voltages that control that analog generating circuitry are generated by a microprocessor. In this case, it's the classic Z80 that showed up in the Radio Shack TRS-80 computer and game consoles like the ColecoVision and the Sega Master System. Here, the Z80 would drive that analog sound generating circuitry using control voltages via digital to analog converters. Again, those digital analog converters weren't generating the audio. They were generating control signals for the analog circuitry. And then the front panel controls would be potentiometers, but they were being read by the microprocessor. So the microprocessor is an intermediary. This allows the user to be able to create patches using the knobs on the control panel, save those patches, and then recall those patches easily. And this was the trend for a lot of instruments from this point forward. And over here we have Sequential Circuits founder and Prophet 5 designer Dave Smith, along with Roger O'Donnell, who's keyboard player for The Cure. Now, there were some instruments that were fully digital in that they used digital to analog converters to create the sound in addition to overall controlling the instrument. They tended to be pretty expensive, though. One of them was the digital keyboard Synergy, and it used a method called additive synthesis, where you would build up sounds from individual sine wave components, basically synthesizing sound from a Fourier viewpoint. So the digital keyboard Synergy had a whopping 32 digital oscillators that in a traditional additive synthesis mode would be using sine waves, but you could also have triangle waves. And the Synergy has some interesting aspects that really have not been duplicated a whole lot. They had extraordinarily sophisticated envelopes for both the pitch and the frequency, and they also had this interpolation approach where you could define a set of characteristics for these envelopes for the low end and the high end of the keyboard, and it could interpolate between them across the keyboard, and it could also do a similar interpolation over the range of velocities. So pressing the key softly or smacking the key could give you these wildly different kind of sounds, and it could interpolate in these two dimensions. Now, technically speaking, additive synthesis is something you could do with analog technology. You would just need a lot of analog hardware to try to do anything interesting. The Synergy was a commercialization of research that Hal Alice did while at Bell Labs. It's an immensely clever design that exploits trigonometric identities to avoid needing high-speed digital multiplier chips, which were extremely expensive at the time. The Synergy had some sounds built into its ROM, and you could also plug in ROM cartridges that looked a lot like the Atari 2600 cartridges containing more sounds. And if your Synergy had the right internal add-on boards, you could create your own sounds on a K-Pro running CPM. Here's the keyboard for my Synergy next to some Hammond organ tone wheel assemblies. So let's lift the lid and take a look at what's inside. There's a fan to try to keep the whole thing cool. Here you see the bits of circuitry associated with all of the various front panel controls. And we see that the Synergy consists of three main circuit boards. On the left, we have a 16-bit digital to analog converter, which would have been insanely expensive in the early 80s. The oscillator board has no custom ASICs or FPGAs or anything like that. It's just 74 series logic chips. And notice the daughter boards on the Z80 computer board are connected to the motherboard by wire wrap pins that are just jammed down into these IC sockets. These are a maintenance nightmare. So if you ship a digital keyboard Synergy, it is pretty much guaranteed to not work on the other end. Eventually, I plan to get around to replacing the IC socket scheme with some real matching headers. In the first part of this lecture series, we talked about Wendy Carlos and her groundbreaking album Switched on Bach. She later adopted digital techniques and was particularly fond of the digital keyboard synergy. She developed a set of orchestral-type sounds entirely by ear. And remember, this is additive synthesis. She's defining pitch and amplitude envelopes of individual sine waves and created some really amazing timbres. And she did this without the aid of computers taking fast Fourier transforms to do spectrum analysis for her. To experience these timbres on their own, you should check out Digital Moonscapes. She called this the LSI Philharmonic. That would be large-scale integration, referring to the integrated circuits. And she combined these kinds of digital timbres with live orchestral instruments in her soundtrack to the movie Tron. The precise digital nature of the synergy allowed her to experiment with alternative tuning systems going far beyond traditional Western 12-tone temperament, and she thoroughly explored these new systems in her album Beauty and the Beast. I would like to play for you a few examples from that. That sort of clinky-clanky sound is something that you really need digital synthesis for. That would be very difficult to produce with purely analog hardware. There were other fully digital instruments like the New England Digital Synclavier, and there were hybrid instruments like the Wave PPG 2.2 and 2.3, which had simple digital oscillators, but play those oscillators through voltage-controlled filters and amplifiers. In any case, all of these tended to be very expensive. So, in the early 80s, most synthesizers that were affordable by not insanely wealthy musicians were still based on analog sound generating hardware, even if that hardware was being driven and controlled by a computer. So, in addition to Dave Smith's sequential circuits, we had a series of instruments by Tom Oberheim, and here's an example from my middle school days. And at the time, it was really controversial for guitar god Eddie Van Halen to be getting into synthesizers. Here's the opening track from that album, 1984. And you have to love those big resonant filter sweeps. A good portion of the second part of this course will be about voltage-controlled filters and how to make sounds go wow. And when you really get to it, my Analog Circuits for Music Synthesis course is really just all about making things that go wow. Roland had a series of analog polysynths, much loved by artists like Howard Jones and featured in many songs by Duran Duran. The Jupiter 8 is also known for providing the bass line for the Sir Mix-a-Lot composition Baby Got Back. And Moog eventually got in on the true polysynth action with the Memory Moog, which was basically like 6 mini Moogs all stuck together with a nice computer-controlled interface. Unfortunately, Moog went out of business. And also, Dave Smith's sequential circuits went out of business. And Tom Oberheim's company went out of business. All of these American synth manufacturers that got started in a garage went out of business, all buried under the might of an instrument called the DX7. One day, John Chowning, a researcher at Stanford, was experimenting with vibrato and noticed that if he cranked the vibrato rate itself up into the audio frequencies, he could get interesting timbres out. Now, frequency modulation is something that you can do on an analog synthesizer. People have been doing it for years. But the level of precision of pitch control that you need to create sounds with distinct pitches is something that's really hard to do given the inherent imprecision of analog circuitry. It's something you really need digital approaches to do. Chowning's patent both covered the idea of using FM to do music synthesis and also the particularly clever implementation that used logarithmic and exponential tables, basically to avoid multiplication by using tricks that slide rules use. They tried shopping this technology around to a variety of American companies, but I'm going to guess that a lot of folks just really didn't understand it. It's fairly esoteric. They approached Yamaha with it, and Yamaha said yes. And you can think of the GS1 and GS2 sort of as prototypes. It's kind of like the way Yamaha created the GX1 and then refined that technology and shrunk it down into the CS80. The DX7 is kind of a distillation of the lessons learned from the GS1 and GS2. One of these instruments is on the Toto song Africa. So the DX7 started out life as a couple of refrigerator-sized cabinets full of circuitry, Yamaha being a giant company that, in addition to making synthesizers, made guitars and pianos and motorcycles, had the capital needed to create custom digital synthesis chips. I don't actually remember where this particular demo came from, but the thing I want you to note is the kind of clinky sounds you can get that are difficult to pull off in analog. Those kind of super bright attacks, both in the top line and in the bass line, are things that FM synthesis is very good at. The main thing to note here is that this is barely above $2,000, and compared to something like $5,000 plus for a Synergy, pretty much meant that the future of the Synergy wasn't very bright. FM was capable of some sounds that analog synths generally weren't able to pull off. For better for worse, that Whitney Houston ballad electric piano sound that you heard on pretty much every other track in the 1980s, that's from a DX7. In parallel with synthesizers based on both analog and digital technology, there were a set of instruments developed based on digital sampling and playing those samples back at different rates. And we'll start there next time.